2 hours after I gave birth, I looked at my husband and asked him to hold our daughter. He didn't move. He just stood there in his tailored gray coat, looking at her like she was a stranger's mistake left on his doorstep. Then he leaned down close enough that only I could hear him and said the words that would end our marriage before the sun came up. I already have a son with another woman. I'm not putting my name on this baby. I didn't cry. I didn't ask him to repeat himself. I looked down at my daughter's face, still soft and pink and completely unaware that her father had just chosen someone else. In the same breath, he refused her. I pulled her closer against my chest and I smiled. "Then remember this moment," I whispered, "because it's the last one you'll ever get from us." He laughed. He actually laughed like I'd said something cute and harmless, something a tired new mother says before she comes back to her senses. He had no idea that by the next morning we would be gone, and that his regret was only just beginning. My name is Sable Reed, and this is the story of the night my husband threw away his family, his fortune, and his future, all in the 2 hours after I became a mother. 4 years earlier, Weston Calloway walked into my life the way expensive things always do, quietly and then all at once. I was working as a contracts auditor for a mid-size firm in Charlotte, the kind of job where you read fine print until your eyes ache and your coffee goes cold twice before noon. He was the heir to Calloway Holdings, a real estate and hospitality group his grandfather had built from a single roadside motel into something that owned skylines. He didn't need to impress anyone. He never raised his voice, never checked his phone at dinner, never once made me feel like an accessory to a life that was already full before I arrived. For the first year, I thought I had found the rarest thing there was, a wealthy man who still remembered how to be kind to a woman who couldn't do anything for him. His mother, Adele, was polite to me, the way people are polite to something they're waiting to replace. His father, Preston Calloway, barely spoke to me at all in those early years, usually leaving the room within minutes of my arrival with some excuse about a call he needed to take. I told myself that was simply his nature. Old money, old manners, old silence. I didn't understand yet that in that family, silence was never neutral. It was a decision made carefully and revisited only when it stopped being useful. We married 18 months after we met. In a small ceremony, Weston insisted on keeping modest. Away from the company noise, he said, squeezing my hand like the two of us were conspiring against something larger than ourselves. I remember standing in the courthouse hallway beforehand, straightening his tie because his hands were shaking, and thinking that a man that nervous about marrying me couldn't possibly be capable of the kind of calm, practiced cruelty I would meet 2 years later in a hospital room. I was wrong about that, the way I was wrong about a lot of things back then, mostly because he was very good at saying them like they were simple truths instead of careful scripts. It was during our second year of marriage that I first heard the name Camila Russo. She was Weston's executive assistant, a woman with sharp tailored blazers and a voice that never rose above a calm, even register. I met her twice at company events. The second time, at a holiday dinner, I caught her glancing at Weston across the room with an expression I couldn't place at the time. Not quite guilt, not quite longing, something closer to exhaustion. I told myself I'd imagined it. I had no real reason to think otherwise. Weston still came home most nights. He still remembered our anniversary. But looking back, the small things had already started. Calls he took in the driveway instead of inside the house. Business trips that got extended by a day, then 2, with explanations that were technically plausible and somehow never quite specific. Whenever I brought up the idea of a bigger family someday, a third child, a bigger house, he'd get quiet in a way that felt less like a man dreaming ahead and more like a man calculating how much longer he could avoid the subject. I noticed I just didn't let myself follow the thought all the way to its ending. There was one night early in that second year when he came home past midnight from what he said was a client dinner, and I found a receipt in his coat pocket the next morning for a restaurant 2 towns over, a place I'd never heard him mention, dated 2 hours earlier than the time he told me he left. I asked him about it over breakfast, half joking, and watched him construct an explanation in real time. A colleague's retirement dinner, a table he joined late, nothing worth remembering. I remember thinking even then that a man telling the truth doesn't usually need 3 sentences to explain one dinner. I let it go anyway because letting things go was easier than being the kind of wife who kept a list. That same holiday dinner later in the evening, I ended up next to Camille near the drink table, while Weston was pulled into a conversation about quarterly numbers across the room. She asked how the nursery planning was going since I'd mentioned trying for a baby to a few people at the office party the year before. It was a small, ordinary question. What I remember is how carefully she asked it, like she was stepping around something she didn't want to disturb, and how she excused herself almost immediately after I answered, before I'd even finished my sentence. I told myself she just wasn't used to small talk with the boss's wife. I didn't think about it again for almost 2 years. Before any of that, before Camille's name ever came up, there were 2 years of fertility appointments that neither of us talked about with anyone outside that clinic waiting room. Weston came to every single one in the first year, held my hand through 2 procedures that didn't take, and told me more than once that we had time, that it would happen when it was supposed to happen. Looking back now, I wonder how much of that patience was real and how much was simply easier to perform than the alternative. A conversation about whether he was even still trying in every sense of that word with me at all. I'll never know for certain when his attention started splitting in 2 directions. I only know that somewhere in that second year, while I was tracking ovulation calendars and crying quietly in parking lots after appointments that went nowhere, another version of the answer he claimed to be waiting for was already underway somewhere else entirely. When I finally got pregnant in the spring of our 3rd year, Weston cried at the ultrasound. I remember it so clearly because it became the memory I held onto through everything that came after. He painted the nursery himself over a single weekend. He picked out a name with me for months, a name we finally agreed on the week before I gave birth, Marlo. I didn't know then that Camille was already several months into a pregnancy of her own. I've since had to accept that I may never know exactly when it began, only that it had been going on long enough and carefully enough that I never once caught it in 4 years of paying attention to almost everything else. What I didn't learn until much later was that Preston had known about the pregnancy for months and had given Weston an ultimatum of his own. Resolve the situation one way or another before the company's board convened for its year-end review, or Preston would raise the matter himself on his own terms in front of people whose opinion of Weston mattered more to him than mine ever had. That review had been moved up once already, and it was scheduled for the week after my due date. Weston hadn't told me any of that. He'd simply started running out of time to keep 2 separate lives from touching. The morning I went into labor, Weston was at the hospital before I had even finished checking in, pacing the small triage room with a nervous energy I mistook at the time for excitement instead of guilt. He held my hand through 11 hours of contractions, timed my breathing, fed me ice chips when I couldn't manage anything else, and told the nurses twice unprompted how excited he was to finally be a father. Looking back, I think some part of him meant it in the moment, the same way an actor can mean a line while he's saying it and still walk off stage into a completely different life 5 minutes later. Mara was born at 6:47 in the morning, a Tuesday. She cried and the sound filled the room in a way I still can't describe, except to say it felt like the beginning of something enormous. I held her against my chest, still trembling, and looked up at Weston, waiting for him to reach for her the way he'd promised he would for the last 9 months. He didn't reach for her. He stepped back toward the window. I told myself he was in shock, so I asked him gently, "Do you want to hold her?" "No," he said, and something in his voice had already gone flat, and careful in a way I hadn't heard from him before. He stepped out into the hallway a few minutes later, and through the half-open door, I heard fragments of a call he clearly thought I couldn't hear. A woman's voice on the other end, tight and insistent, and Weston saying low, Not like this. Not over the phone, before he hung up and stood there for a long moment with his hand still on the doorframe. What I didn't know yet was that Camille had called him twice that morning. The second time to tell him she wasn't willing to stay hidden through another milestone. She wanted their son acknowledged publicly before the board review, not quietly manage around it. And beneath that, a text had come in from his mother 20 minutes earlier, letting him know she and Preston were already on their way to the hospital to meet their new granddaughter, with no indication either of them planned to pretend. Once they arrived, that there was only one grandchild worth acknowledging that year. Weston had maybe an hour before his own parents walked into that room and decided on their terms instead of his exactly how this would unfold in front of me. He came back in wearing a fresh suit, and I understand now that he wasn't dressing for a conversation he wanted to have. He was dressing for one he'd run out of ways to avoid. 2 hours later, after the nurses had cleaned up and the room had gone quiet, he came back in as though he'd stepped out just to change into something more appropriate for what he was about to say. He told me about Camille and a son named after his grandfather, born 4 months earlier. His parents, he said, had already met the baby and were, though he didn't say it outright, minutes away from walking through my door. "My family needs a male heir," he said, like he was reading from a memo someone else had written for him. Camille gave them one. "I won't acknowledge your daughter as a Calloway. I want to tell you I screamed. I didn't." I looked at my daughter's small sleeping face, and something in me went still and sharp at the exact same time, like a door closing somewhere far away. "You're choosing them," I said, not a question. "I'm choosing my family's future," he said, like the two of us weren't standing in the middle of it. I smiled. It surprised him. I could see it shift something in his jaw. "Then remember this moment," I told him, "because it's the last one you're going to get from us." He laughed and walked out to take a phone call already halfway back to whatever life he thought was waiting for him on the other end of that hallway. I stayed in that hospital for 2 more nights, the standard recovery time my doctor recommended, and I let myself have those 2 nights because I didn't trust my own legs yet, let alone my judgment. Weston didn't come back. My sister, Odette, drove 4 hours from Savannah the moment I called her that first night, arriving before sunrise, still in the clothes she'd slept in. She didn't ask if I was okay. She asked what I needed in that order, and then she simply took over, holding Marlo so I could sleep in real stretches instead of fragments, arguing gently with a nurse about my pain medication schedule, sitting in the corner chair through visiting hours like she intended to outlast anyone who might try to make me leave before I was ready. She told me at my own wedding, quietly over cake, that Weston had the kind of politeness that only shows up when someone's watching. I'd laughed it off then. I didn't laugh sitting in that hospital room, finally understanding exactly what she'd meant 4 years too late. She was the one sitting beside my bed instead of Weston, and somewhere in that second night, I stopped waiting for him to walk back through the door. It was on that second night that I finally returned a call I'd been putting off for 3 weeks from my late Uncle Elliot's estate attorney, a woman named Josephine Nader. Elliot had died 8 months earlier, a retired structural engineer who spent 40 years designing the bones of buildings other men got credit for. I'd assumed the call was routine paperwork, nothing that mattered next to a first pregnancy. I was wrong. Josephine told me later that she hadn't called me 3 weeks straight over something routine. Elliot had come to her office a year before he died, unprompted, and asked her to review an old partnership agreement he still held from a development deal decades earlier, one that had since been folded into Callaway Holdings when the company expanded. He told her he wanted to make sure the paperwork still meant what it used to mean. She found something that concerned her enough to keep calling a voting agreement, still active, still binding, that Elliot had never dissolved, tied to his 11% stake in the company's development arm. She told me Elliot had never fully explained why he wanted it reviewed, only that he trusted her to understand it eventually, even if he wasn't around to explain it himself. She'd worked with him for nearly 15 years and said she still hadn't fully understood him until she watched in real time exactly what that quiet preparation had been protecting all along. She didn't know yet what I'd need it for. She just knew, in her words, that some inheritances are worth understanding before you need them, not after. I'd asked her from that hospital bed what any of it meant for me now. It means, she said, you have more say in that company than your husband thinks you do. I didn't rush anything the way I might tell it for effect. I went home first to the house Weston and I had shared for exactly 1 week because I needed somewhere familiar to figure out what came next, and because a lawyer with any sense will tell you not to make permanent decisions 3 days postpartum. Weston didn't come home either. He stayed at his parents' house, and the only contact I had from him during that week was a single text asking whether I'd had time to think things over, as though I was the one who needed to reconsider a decision he'd made months before I ever went into labor. He called once that week on the 4th night, and I almost didn't pick up. When I did, he didn't ask about Marlo. He asked whether I'd spoken to anyone at the company in a tone that made it clear he already suspected I had. I told him the truth that I hadn't decided anything yet, which was accurate, even if it wasn't the whole picture. He said almost gently that he hoped we could keep this civil for everyone's sake, as though civility was something he'd only just remembered existed, now that it might cost him something to lose it. I hung up without answering and sat with the phone in my lap for a long time afterward, listening to Marlo breathe in the bassinet beside the bed, trying to figure out which version of him had ever actually been real. I spent most of that week doing ordinary things that felt strange in the context of everything else. Folding tiny clothes, learning the rhythm of a newborn's cries, standing in the nursery, he painted himself, and running my hand along a wall that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else's marriage. On the 5th night, I finally opened the closet and started packing quietly, one drawer at a time, not out of anger, but because staying had stopped making sense the moment I let myself admit it. Odette came back that weekend to help me carry boxes to a rental 2 streets from her own house, close enough that she could still show up unannounced with groceries and an opinion about everything. By the end of that week, Josephine and I had gone through the folder properly in daylight at her office, with real coffee and enough time to ask questions. What Elliot's shares gave me wasn't control of the company. It was a legal right to request a formal review of executive conduct that could expose Callaway Holdings to reputational or financial risk during any active financing period, and the company happened to be mid-refinancing that quarter, a fact that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with the kind of aggressive expansion Weston's father had been pushing for years. An affair that had produced 2 competing children, one of them born to an employee, during a period when Weston had personally signed statements to lenders describing his stable personal circumstances, was exactly the kind of conduct that review existed to catch. I filed the request through Josephine at the start of the 2nd week. I moved out of the house permanently that same week into a rental neuro debt with Marlo, and let the company's own process do something I never could have done from a hospital bed, force one. Weston to explain himself to people who had never once needed my permission to ask hard questions. 2 weeks after I filed before the board convened, Camille called me. I almost didn't answer. When I did, she told me she'd heard about the review through the office, and she wanted to say something before it became a spectacle. She sounded tired in a way that had nothing to do with a newborn, a kind of tired I recognized because I'd been carrying a version of it myself for 4 years without a name for it. She told me she'd grown up an only child in a small town outside Baton Rouge, that she'd moved to Charlotte for the job with no family nearby, and that somewhere in the loneliness of that first year working for Weston, careful attention had started to feel like something it wasn't. She said she told herself more than once that she'd stop answering his calls after hours and never quite managed it until stopping would have meant losing the only steady thing in a city where she still didn't know anyone else well enough to call at midnight. She told me Weston had promised her months into things, that he intended to leave me eventually, that by the time she let herself believe him, she was already pregnant, already isolated, already unsure who else she could tell. "He does this," she said quietly. "He tells people exactly enough to keep them moving in his direction." I asked her why she was telling me now. She was quiet for a long moment. "Because someone should know the truth going in," she finally said, instead of finding out piece by piece in front of an audience. I thought about the nursery he painted, the ultrasound he'd cried at, and I understood that Camille and I had been handed versions of the exact same performance, staged for two different women who each thought they were the only audience. The board meeting happened on a Thursday in a glass room on the 14th floor that smelled like fresh coffee and something colder underneath it. I wasn't required to attend in person. Josephine handled the procedural side, but I went anyway. Marlowe asleep in a carrier against my chest, because I wanted Weston to see exactly who was sitting across the table from him when his father finally asked him to explain himself out loud. Preston asked Weston in front of 6 board members and 2 outside counsel whether it was true he had fathered a child with an employee, while personally certifying to lenders that his circumstances were stable. Weston said the situation was being handled privately. Preston asked whether privately included leaving his newborn daughter in a hospital room in front of nursing staff who would remember every detail of it. Weston didn't have an answer for that one. He looked for the first time in 4 years like a man who had run out of the right sentence to say. Then a former colleague of Weston's, a man who'd left the company on unfriendly terms 2 months earlier after a dispute over a bonus he felt he'd been unfairly denied, sent Josephine a message thread he'd been sitting on out of simple resentment. Weston joking months before that once the air situation was settled, he planned to quietly separate from Camille within a year, once the optics no longer mattered. It wasn't luck that handed us that thread. It was the ordinary, predictable consequence of treating people as disposable and assuming none of them would ever compare notes or wait for the right moment to use what they'd kept. Camille sat through that reading with her hands flat on the table. When it was finished, she stood, straightened her blazer, and said the only sentence I ever heard her speak to Weston directly. "You should have just told the truth to somebody, anybody, even once, before it cost this much." Then she walked out. Weston caught me in the elevator afterward before I could reach the parking garage. He looked smaller in that mirrored box than I had ever seen him look in 4 years of marriage, his jaw working like he was trying to find a version of himself that could still talk his way out of a room. "You planned this?" he said. Not quite a question, like he needed it to be my fault instead of his own. I didn't have to plan anything. I told him, "I just stopped covering for you the second you stopped pretending." The doors opened before he could answer, and I walked out into the parking garage with my daughter asleep against my chest, and I didn't look back to see whether he followed. What followed wasn't a clean, legal victory handed to me by an old family clause, the way I might have wished for it to be. The trust language Elliot's generation had written decades earlier required any heir to be born within an intact marriage to hold inheritance priority, and that language created exactly what Josephine called it from the start: a genuine succession dispute, not an automatic answer. Calloway's attorneys argued one interpretation. Josephine argued another. There were depositions, financial disclosures, an outside mediator brought in specifically to keep the dispute from spilling into a courtroom the family wanted to avoid at almost any cost, and more than one afternoon where Josephine warned me the outcome could still go either way, depending on which precedent the mediator found more persuasive. It took the better part of 4 months alongside the divorce proceedings before the board's outside counsel finally settled the matter through negotiation rather than a clean ruling. Marlowe would hold formal inheritance standing as the only child born inside the marriage on record, while Camille's son would remain outside the company's succession structure entirely, a separate matter for Weston to resolve if he chose to on his own through whatever private arrangement he could manage. Without the company's backing, Weston hadn't secured an heir. He'd spent a year manufacturing a dispute that ended with the daughter he refused to hold, becoming the only child anyone in that family was legally required to provide for. The divorce settlement itself took those same 4 months. I didn't ask for anything vindictive in the paperwork. I asked for what was fair. And with Elliot's shares behind me and a board that no longer trusted Weston with much of anything, fair turned out to be more than either of us expected going in. The custody arrangement was the only part where Weston initially showed up looking like the man I'd married. He asked for structured visitation, and I let the mediator set reasonable terms because I wanted to be able to tell Marlo honestly someday that I hadn't been the one who closed every door. He used 4 of his first 6 scheduled visits, showing up late to 2 of them and cutting a 3rd short for a work call. By her first birthday, he'd stopped scheduling them at all. And no clause, no mediator, and no amount of money ever managed to fix the part of him that had made that choice 2 hours after she was born. Preston reached out himself, almost a year after the board meeting, and asked if we could talk without lawyers in the room. We met at a coffee shop near my new house. Neutral ground, and he sat across from me, looking older than I remembered, his hands wrapped around a cup he never drank from. He told me in a conversation that lasted longer than any I'd ever had with him during my marriage, that his own father had run their family the same way, measuring people by usefulness instead of character, keeping score instead of keeping close. He said his father had once told him when Preston was barely older than Weston was now. That sentiment was a luxury the family business couldn't afford, and that he'd spent decades believing that sentence, without ever once questioning where it had actually gotten any of them. He said he hadn't realized how completely he'd repeated it with his own son until he watched Weston walk out of a hospital room instead of toward his daughter, and recognized the exact shape of his own coldness looking back at him. It wasn't an apology, not in so many words. It was closer to an explanation offered late. For a silence, he finally seemed to understand he'd helped build long before I ever arrived in that family. Adele sent one letter around that same time on the same cream stationery she'd used for our wedding invitations, saying she hoped I would understand these things are complicated. I read it twice and didn't answer. Some understanding is an ode just because someone finally decides to ask for it after the damage is already done. I moved 2 hours away to a quiet house with a yard and a maple tree Marlo insists on naming every season. Odette drives up most Sundays, still smelling faintly like whatever her husband was repairing that week, and she still hasn't let me live down the fact that she distrusted Weston's politeness years before I was ready to hear it. Josephine handles the trust paperwork twice a year now, always over coffee, always with the same dry joke about how 3 weeks of unanswered voicemails turned into the most useful legal strategy she never planned to hand me. Preston sends a card on Marlo's birthday, now signed simply Grandfather. And last year, he asked through Josephine whether he could visit occasionally on neutral terms, no expectations attached. I said yes, mostly because Marlo deserves to decipher herself when she's older. What kind of relationship she wants with a family whose name she carries and whose fortune, as it turned out, became legally hers before her father ever fully understood what he'd lost. Weston called me once almost a year after everything. Late at night, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. None of the calm authority left in it at all. He asked if there was still a way to be part of Marlo's life, the way he should have been from the very beginning, before any of this had a chance to happen. I thought about the hospital room, the 2 hours he made me sit there believing he might still choose us before he decided not to. You had your 2 hours, I told him. I gave you the rest of your life after that to change your mind, and you spent every bit of it making sure you didn't. I hung up, and I haven't heard from him since. Not a card, not a message, not even through Josephine. Marlo is walking now fast and a little reckless, the way toddlers are when they've decided the whole world exists, specifically for them to explore. She has my mouth and somebody else's stubborn chin, and she has started asking in the fragmented way 2-year-olds ask anything where her father is. I haven't found the right words yet. I don't think there's a version of a truth that fits neatly into a toddler's vocabulary. So for now, I tell her he's far away, and I let that be enough, knowing there's a harder conversation waiting for us both somewhere down the road, one I refuse to have before she's actually ready to hear it. I think about that hospital room more than I probably should, given how far away it feels now. Not the cruelty of it. Not even the 2 hours themselves, but the exact moment right before I smiled, the half second where I could have chosen to fall apart instead. And something in me, quieter than anger and steadier than grief, decided not to. I don't know exactly where that steadiness came from. Maybe it was Elliot's waiting patiently in old paperwork for a moment he never got to see. Maybe it was Odette's sitting beside that bed instead of the man who should have been there. Maybe it was just what happens when a person finally runs out of reasons to make herself smaller for someone who was never going to notice the effort anyway. Every night before she falls asleep, I tell Marlo the same thing, that the people who are supposed to choose you sometimes don't. And that isn't the end of the story. It's just the part where you find out who does. Some nights she's already asleep before I finish saying it. And I say it anyway. Quietly, mostly for myself at this point, because it's still the truest thing I know how to tell either of us. Sometimes winning isn't getting revenge. Sometimes it's just making sure the next generation never has to beg to be chosen. If you were me, lying in that hospital bed, with a promise breaking apart right in front of you, would you have smiled the way I did, or would you have let him see exactly what you were feeling in that moment? Tell me in the comments, because I still think about which one of us actually walked away having one.